Welcome, I'm Ann Trujillo. Let's be honest, you might not be comfortable talking about race and racism with the young people in your life. And that's why Denver 7 is partnering with the Girl Scouts of Colorado to foster these important conversations. And we've gathered experts here to help advise you as parents and caregivers on how to get the conversation started. In this discussion, we're going to cover why it's important to confront your own biases to model how you want youth in your life to respond. Why we shouldn't ignore both the history and current movement of our country. Rather, talk to youth about these topics using age-appropriate language and techniques. What do you say when you don't know what to say? And how discussing these topics can actually help our young people combat anxiety. And joining us for this conversation now are Lindsay Standish, the Chief Outdoor Program Officer for Girl Scouts Colorado, pediatrician Dr. Brandy Freeman from Children's Hospital Colorado, also from the hospital, Robert Franklin, the Program Manager for Diversity, Health, Equity, and Inclusion, and Faraday Rodriguez, the Director of El Bucecito Preschool's Valley Settlement Project in the Roaring Fork Valley. So thank you all for joining in on this very important conversation. I think I want to start with Dr. Freeman first to just talk about why is the issue of race just such an uncomfortable topic for most people?
Yeah, I think it's uncomfortable for a lot of reasons. The history of our country, I think it's something that can't be ignored. I think people honestly at heart are good people and want to not harm someone. But when we think about issues of race and think about history, the history of our country related to that, we recognize that wrongs have been made, and trying to figure out how do you work through that in a way that's productive, progressive. It's something that I think just everyone finds hard just because it's such a sensitive topic.
And I think a lot of people are doing some soul searching right now. So what would you say, and any of you, what would you say to anyone who is doing this soul searching right now, and where they should be looking?
I can hop in just to start. I think one of the things that I encourage my colleagues, families that I work with to think about and recognize is that it is a process that takes time. It is not something that is going to change overnight, and it might be something, or it will be something that's uncomfortable, but not to be afraid of it, to not be afraid of what you're going to find, and really taking the time to do that soul searching is what is most important in the process.
And I think for you, Lindsay and Faraday, you both deal with children. What are you saying to children right now?
Yeah, with Girl Scouts, we actually have taken a look at how developmentally do you talk to different ages about this, and developed some programming and a curriculum specifically for kindergarten through 12th graders to also aid parents in how to start that conversation and how to do that developmentally appropriate. So we realized that it was something, as Dr. Freeman was saying, that can be intimidating or can be really scary for parents to know where to start, and wanted to give some resources to be able to do that no matter what age their children are.
And it doesn't have to be parents, right, Faraday?
No, yeah. Something that we really like to focus on is talking about emotions and feelings, and making sure children's emotions and what they're thinking is validated and heard by adults and people that make them feel safe. And that way they are more open to having these conversations and asking questions. And that way we can, support them and them processing all of this.
And Mr. Franklin, talk about the impact of trying to bring this all together in the workplace. I imagine that is a huge undertaking, particularly working in a hospital setting.
It can be, and one of the biggest myths that we have is that differences don't make a difference. That's not just in healthcare, that's in education, that's everywhere we are. And so the hardest part is really unblocking that from our mindset and our learning so we can actually highlight some of these differences and talk about, especially in the healthcare system, how I identify is going to change how I walk out of that hospital situation. And that's a tough pill to swallow after hundreds of thousands of dollars of learning about medicine. And then you're going to tell me that what I didn't learn, I have to now learn while I'm practicing. It's really tough. And we're here for that.
So explain how that works. I mean, give us some examples. I mean, a lot of adults will be watching this going, what can I do in my own workplace that will make a difference?
Yeah, so I think perspective taking is the first thing that I would offer, no matter what workplace you're in. What would it be like if you walked into your building, your organization, in another person's skin tone, right? Or another person's identity and another person's lifestyle? Would you feel the same way? And if the answer is no, that's where you start. You talked about soul searching. You begin with the internal. What would it feel like for me to be different at my organization? And if anything comes up negative, that's where you want to start. At a hospital is no different than that. We know that because of your language at home, because of where you live and your zip code, that your healthcare outcomes are likely to be different than someone who has more privilege, more access. And so we have to talk about how to treat not the people and the folks that are in these particular zip codes, but we need to treat the systems, the institutions that created the poverty, the disparity that we're experiencing, that we see.
So let's go back to focusing on children and really the words that we want to use with kids. And I know it's different if you're talking to a 6-year-old versus a 16-year-old. So help us understand how you choose those words and give us, Dr. Freeman, I'll ask you, give us some examples of how you have those conversations with children. What words do you choose?
So I think in having those discussions, it's really important to think about their developmental level. We know that children as young as 6 months can recognize differences in color, and recognizing that that is a reality, that people look different and that there are different shades and different cultures and different things that children are going to notice. And it's important in terms of choosing those words, thinking about the concrete the developmental level that a child is at, whether it is a toddler who's really just going to be looking at observation, or a high school student who can begin to understand the history of our country. I think it's really important to take that into account.
So again, though, what words do you choose, and how pointed are you? Do you describe people by skin color? What do you say to children who notice differences, and how do you verbalize that?
So I think it's important to take those questions into context. If it is a positive association, or a negative association, looking at the situation that of what a child is interacting with. So if a child is looking at me and saying that, she's a Black person, she's a brown person, that's a correct statement. They're not saying anything that is offensive or is wrong. If they're adding something to it that is a negative connotation, or adding a qualifying characteristic to it, I think that's where we have to think about what is the child thinking and what might be behind that.
Yeah, in our home, we're raising multi-ethnic kids, and so from the very get-go, mommy and daddy are different. We have different skin tones. We have different hair types. When we go to grandma's house, we eat different food, and all of those things are cool. It's cool to be different. We started with that at a very young age with both of our kids. And as they started to understand the differences that they would see at school, not just inside their family, but maybe in the mall, and we talk about that. And what is that difference called? Well, dad identifies as Black. Dad's a Black man. Mom is Chinese. Mom is white. Grandma's white. And that's okay. And all of those things are okay. And I would echo what Dr. Freeman is talking about. As soon as we started to see that there was an attachment to what is Black and loud, or what is white and pure, then we would start to have conversations about how skin color does not denote good or bad. It just denotes difference.
So that conversation can start at a very young age then.
Most definitely. We were talking about it as soon as the kids could talk, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. And I think there have been studies that have shown that. And the scary thing about the studies has been that they've shown the negative associations as early as preschool. So I think it's a conversation that's really important to have early, as soon as you notice something, or as you're having those discussions, just from the get-go, to make sure that you're using positivity and using them without judgment.
I remember with my own kids who are now adults always saying to them, we have beautiful brown skin, always saying those words, just so as you did, Robert, at a very young age, to make sure that they fully understood that we really do have beautiful brown skin, and there was a positivity to that. So I see your point. Dr. Freeman, you talked about that first negative interaction. that could be anywhere, right? That could be, Lindsay, with the Girl Scouts. There could be some interaction that you see. How do you handle those situations?
Yeah, well, we really train all of our staff and our volunteers to be able to. Girl Scouts from the beginning has been focused on making sure that we're accepting and inclusive of everyone and making sure that we can teach those values as well. And I think it's something that if an experience were to happen, just as Dr. Freeman and Robert were saying, that you don't shy away from having a conversation, that you're able to help to validate maybe what was happening there and work through it, and be able to say, you know, maybe there was a misunderstanding here, or it sounds like you were fearful that this may happen, and clear up some of those, and ultimately to have those conversations with parents as well, so they're a part of that.
So if any one of you has seen or experienced a negative interaction, what do you do? What do you recommend for other parents, other adults, workplace, playground, wherever?
I would say if you're having this conversation after with the child, is just to be honest about what you're feeling, about what you think and what you saw, and say it clearly. You know, that was not right. That made me feel scared. That made me feel mad. And then continue to have this conversation. It can't just be a one-time thing. And also know that as an adult, you're not going to have all the answers in that moment. And so the child has a question for you that you can't answer, it's definitely okay to say, I don't know that right now, but I will try my hardest to answer that question for you. And that also just helps to keep this conversation and the learning going.
How do you prepare? Go ahead, yes.
I was just going to add to what Faraday said and talk about intent versus impact. And a lot of kids aren't going to understand that, but as a parent, understanding that your 6-7-year-old probably didn't mean to be mean, right? So you can have that conversation. And for yourself on the inside, it's also important to think about what's the impact of words, phrases, actions that your kid or that you and your family might have done, how that might impact someone else, and that they're two different things, and they can both be dealt with differently, and at the same time they can be dealt with at the same time. So Faraday talks about talk to your kid and have that conversation, and also understand that even if your kid is 5 years old, there's an impact that negative words and associations have on other people.
And what happens when that happens, when that happens, when your kids are not there under your watch? Let's say your kids are, you know, at the pool with some other families, and they come home and tell you, someone called me a name, or I heard this, you know, bad interaction. How do you respond to that?
Every day is different. I would tell you that when our kids have come home and talked about how they've been treated differently because of how they show up or what their skin color is like, we have a conversation about, well, just like what you said, Ann, you know, being different is cool. Black is beautiful, brown is beautiful. And so not everybody understands that. Not every friend that you may have or a teacher that you may have is going to feel the same way that we do. So let's talk about, how did that make you feel? Where do you think that came from? And then what do we need to do to fix it? Does that mean that we need to go back to that situation and have a conversation and prepare them with those kinds of words? Or is that a place to avoid because you know that you're not going to be welcome somewhere because of the skin color that you have or the hair type that you have? So those real conversations started in elementary school.
Anybody else want to jump in on that?
I think just adding that, exactly building on what Robert said, that it's an ongoing conversation that for so many people, I think, especially if it's intimidating to have the conversation, it's never a one and done, that this is ongoing in everyday life. It doesn't have to take an action to talk about it. It should be talked about at all times, but also if there is something that happens, making sure you're continuously following up on it and using these as teachable moments to make sure that it's embedded into everyday life and it's not just a one-time conversation that we had and now we're finished.
Some of the conversations can be so positive. How important is it to incorporate history? You know, the Dr. Martin Luther King, John Lewis, you know, Cesar Chavez. I mean, some of these people who have provided inspiration for a lot of people. That, I assume, that is something as well that you all might think is something that could start at a young age as well, correct?
I would agree that definitely starting at a young age, is a really important thing to do in terms of talking about history, talking about impact. In some ways, it's going to be supplementing what they're receiving in other locations. I think in terms of talking about those things, I think also recognizing that this is not a new struggle, and that I think in particular with certain, more recently, people have been like, well, let's change things right now. And I think recognizing that people have been working on this for a very long time. And I think we are at an inflection point where it's possible to really make progress, but recognizing that this is not going to happen overnight. We're working with over 400 years of history in this country, and it's going to take time, it's going to take dedication in order to truly make a difference.
In fact, give us some examples of where you see that racism is embedded in our society. What are some of the potholes out there that we should all be aware of?
If you want to stick with education, we got to tell our history accurately and from multiple lenses. So to build on Dr. Freeman's point, if we start talking about how this country was built and upon whose backs and who was on this land first, accurately, that it's not a celebratory history, that our kids will start to learn that maybe there's some repairing that we need to do when they become adults. That's one of the biggest potholes, is that we're teaching American history in disparate ways that have our kids grow up thinking that everything was hunky-dory when the Pilgrims came to Plymouth Rock. And that is not the case. It's not easy to tell a third grader about what really happened, but there are ways that we can have this conversation about it was a land takeover. It was not amicable up and down the 13 colonies. That's a huge pothole.
How do we change that conversation when that's still, as far as I know, that's still what people are learning in school?
If you want a local example, look at Denver Board Chair, I think he is, Tay Anderson. Mm-hmm. He's demanding that schools do differently with education, demanding that Black history, African American history is in every school in Denver public schools. You got to start at the top and work your way through. And there are certainly seriously very interested and engaged teachers already implementing things in their work. And so lift them up, right? And find those folks as well.
Faraday, what are you doing? What do you see happening with the children you're working with?
Yeah, so I work with children, ages 3 to 5. They're, young children, but just as we were saying earlier, we really talk about differences and how it makes everybody special, and how it's not a bad thing. It's good to be different, and that's what makes you unique. And accepting and loving each other really is what we try to instill in what I try to instill in all of our students. And to talk about your emotions and to be nice and to be kind to others. I think that's something that from a very young age we have to talk about, is how to be kind to people and how good it feels to be kind and how it makes other people feel good too.
And I know, Lindsay, that you talk about, or you use role play within Girl Scouts and outdoor activities. How do those help? What do you do exactly?
We do, and especially with our new patch that we developed. It's called Diverse, Inclusive, and Together. And that is, we're really proud that it's not only for Girl Scouts, that we saw there was more of a community need than beyond Girl Scout. And if we're developing this curriculum, that it needs to be shared with the community, it needs to be available to families, to schools. Denver Public Schools actually helped us with making it available in Spanish. So it's available to a more wider community to be able to serve. Through this, we also look at, as you were talking about with history, that for the older girls, there's a component to researching it yourself, to really take the lead, to be able to see for yourself what the history has been. That's part of the patch as well. So we make sure that that's included. As far as play, that's really important in what we're doing, that to talk through some more challenging topics. Sometimes for kids, it can be really intimidating to sit down and have a one-on-one conversation and to be asking questions. And definitely that is one approach that parents can take. But play is really where we would see, especially younger kids, thrive in just being able to explore more challenging topics and to be able to see maybe in some role playing they could explore things and verbalize things or express things that otherwise they may not know how. That play really can be the language of children. So we do make sure that that's part of it in the curriculum as well.
Can you give us some examples of how that role playing works?
Yeah. One thing that we would say is even just daily activities for processing could be good, to have ways that play or having fun could be involved, where you could sit down with a group of children and rather than just, specifically asking them if something happened that day, you could do an activity called highs and lows to say, what was your high of the day? What was your low of the day? And help them to process those really good things that happened or maybe the really challenging things that happened. Different ways that perhaps you could have something where maybe in your home you keep a jar, and for kids that are able to write, they could have something where they could write down some questions they have or something really bad that may have happened or something that they want to be able to share and put it in there and then be able to process in that way with them, or draw pictures. Art therapy is a huge thing that is beneficial to be able to process through drawing, through writing. In some of our patch program, we have actually making videos, things that, depending on the development of the child, could be a developmentally appropriate way for them to process it.
Okay, we did get some questions that were submitted through the Girl Scouts office, so I want to ask some of these questions of you. And someone wrote, how can we as a white community best contribute to the idea of speaking truth to power and ensuring that we are upstanders versus bystanders? I'm throwing that out to all of you. So anyone jump in here.
All right, I'll take it. I'll
Go
take
for
it. Yes. So I think the concept of an upstander is really important, that you don't stand by when you watch someone who's being hurt, when someone is not being treated the way that they need to be treated, when someone is not having access to that which we all believe we should all have access. And so while I don't identify as a white person, I would say that I think what's happening, what we're seeing now that Dr. Freeman was talking about, a lot of folks really wanting to get engaged, learn more, read more. And so I would say that if you're not already having opportunities where you and your family are engaging with folks that don't look like you, now's a great time, right? Socially distant appropriately, right? But that you can definitely connect with people that will tell a story differently than your family would, and figuring out what it's like to live with difference, right? Difference from you. And as soon as you start doing that, then you're going to be able to have that story in your heart and in your family story. And then you're going to stand up because you don't want folks who you call friends or folks who you call families or neighbors to be harmed. And we're seeing so much of that right now in the streets. And the task for us will be to continue that, even though it might be tough and even though the conversation may change on our national, in our national conversation.
And do you think that you would answer it the same way if someone had asked, how can we as a Latino community or as an Asian community best contribute to the idea of speaking truth to power? Do you think the answer is the same?
Absolutely. We all have a story. We all have experienced celebration and oppression. We all have highs and lows, as Lindsay was talking about. And so, yes, no matter what background you have, Black, Indigenous, people of color, Latinx, bring it. Bring that story. And being able to tell your story means that you're going to listen to someone else's story. And that's how you speak truth to power.
Let's say your children go to a house where they hear how horrible the protests are, how damaging, how, it's just not a positive thing that they're hearing. How would you handle that conversation? Dr. Freeman?
So I think what can be difficult about that conversation is a child coming back and having been through that experience, processed part of it on their own, and then the retelling of it, and figuring out the impact that had on them. I think it's important to have an honest conversation. This is going to go to a family's own beliefs and value system related to these things. And it's going to be part of the process for the family in terms of processing what they believe and what they think about what has been going on in our society. I think in terms of helping children to process that in a positive way, recognizing the importance of discourse, that people do have different opinions, but then also as a family thinking about what you value, why you value that, and how do you have that experience be the lived experience for your children.
So any of you, give us then the words that you would choose to describe what we're seeing happening around the country right now. Like if you were to have a conversation with a child and say, we're seeing a lot of people who are standing up and fighting, and fighting maybe isn't the right word, speaking up for others. What are the right words to choose if you're speaking to Faraday, your age group, the younger kids, or Lindsay with some of the older scouts? What words would you choose for that conversation?
I think for us, it would be first and foremost, trying to learn from the child to put it into their words first. I think that's an important thing to say. Tell me what you know about what's happening. To really hear from them first and try to get an idea of what their understanding is. That a lot of times kids know a lot more than we maybe give them credit for. So being able to hear from them and then try to take their words and elaborate on it, or have it be really fact-based. I think that's very important. But also knowing that children are going to come with a lot of emotions and being able to help them process what those emotions are as well. But really hearing from them first before we put any ideas in their head, and helping them to understand what they're thinking and feeling about it.
Faraday?
I think that.
Yeah, I agree. I think I would also, as Lindsay was saying, ask them what they know and again what they feel, and then just letting them know that as an adult, and as other adults around them, like their parents, you're there to keep them safe, and to make them feel safe and comfortable. And I think for the age group that I work with, that's the most important part, is making sure children feel safe and heard, when there is so much going on around them that it's really hard for them to understand.
We had another question, and this one is, how do we include reverse discrimination into our conversation?
Yeah, I think we really got to be careful of our words and really check into what we mean by reverse discrimination. So often we hear the words reverse discrimination, meaning that someone who's a person of color, or Black or Indigenous, has done something to hurt or offend a person who identifies as white. And while discrimination does exist, it goes both ways. There's no reversing about it. That the reverse discrimination idea is to say that discrimination works in only one way for the most part. And so we know that when someone is treated unfairly or badly, inequitably because of their background, that's discrimination, and that's something we want to stop. The concept of reverse discrimination makes it seem as though it's a black-white issue, it's a binary issue, and racism, sexism is not. Even xenophobia is not a one-way issue. So I think when we talk about reverse discrimination, we need to be talking about, what are we talking about? Is it racism that we're really dealing with? Who is benefiting from racist policies and racist ideals? And if we're talking about kids, if they're using that phrase, reverse discrimination, we really got to talk about, what does it mean to have power, to be able to discriminate, and how does it work? And they'll figure it out. The kids are so smart, they know it works both ways.
Dr. Freeman, what do you think?
So I agree definitely with what Robert's saying. I think in an academic setting, we often hear those words spoken about with the educational setting, offers of differences related to opportunity and that sort of thing. And I think where that, the word I guess is disagreement about what can be occurring in those situations goes back to what we value. And I think goes really to that question of power. And I think also you introduce into that the message of privilege, and how does that interact into what we value when we're thinking about educational settings, whether it's admission or something to that effect. There's certain things that our society has put more value on. And I think often that does not necessarily equate to a universal distribution of that privilege or that opportunity, and that can cause differences related to what someone perceives as discrimination. So I think if we think about those other things that are playing into it, power, privilege, etc., I think that can help us take away at least the negative connotation from that conversation.
I want to go back to something, Robert, in your notes where you say for parents, teaching your kids about difference happens as much on purpose as it does subconsciously. What do you mean by that?
Well, Dr. Freeman talked about it, that as soon as 6 months, we see babies understand these differences. How is that? Most of it, no one falls out of the womb and being racist or being a bigot. That doesn't happen, right? That we are acculturated, we are programmed, if you will, by our surroundings, by our parents, by the things we hear and that we don't hear. And so as we talked about earlier, if the people that your 6-month-old baby is around are all from all kinds of backgrounds and all kinds of shapes and sizes, then they're more likely to see difference as positive. If you interact with difference positively, then so will your child, because they learn those things. We learn those things from our parents, our community, our media. And so when we start to see those positive influences, those positive role models, and they look different from me and they sound different than me, they pray differently than from me, then I'm going to understand that that's a good thing and that I want to interact more with that. And if my background is more homogeneous, right? Everyone has the same skin tone as I do. We all go to the same church. We all listen to the same music. We all have about the same amount of income. Then when I interact with difference, I'm not going to know what to do with it. And it's most likely that my parents didn't either. So we learn that stuff, and as parents, we teach that stuff, even though we don't know we're doing it right then and there.
I know, Faraday, you often talk about resources to protect against racism. What would those be? What do you mean by that?
Well, just knowing, what support you have in your community, whether that is a family member, a coworker, a mental health professional, just being well connected in your community and knowing who to go, where to go if you ever encounter any racism or have any questions for yourself or your family. Just making sure you're well connected and have a support system around you.
And how do you know? I mean, Lindsay, I think your idea was great of, putting thoughts or comments into, to talk about at another point. But what if the child is not verbal or does not really know how to verbalize what might be anxiety or anger, or after having dealt with an uncomfortable situation? How do you work with children like that?
Yeah, I think that's, again, where the importance of play is so critical, especially for younger children who may not have the words. You may see the way that they're expressing through their play, if it is angry, or if they're expressing different emotions. That could be a way that you could then implement, whether it's through drawing or something that they can actually use some of those coping skills to get out some aggression. I think being able to see where they're coming from with that and using that as a starting point to see how they're expressing their emotions, and then where to go with some conversations about. And again, I think it depends on if they're nonverbal because of their age, or because if they have maybe some different abilities, and how to focus on supporting them through that.
Sure.
But there's a lot of different ways through play and through different coping mechanisms that we can work with children to figure out what emotions they're feeling and how to help process that.
Anyone else have suggestions on coping skills?
Well, something that we talk about in our ECE classes at Colorado Mountain College is just creating a safe space for students. And like I've been saying, just having open conversations, bringing in different, books, resources, sharing different ideas, and just, really just creating a safe, comfortable space for, any student. And not only for the students, but for yourself. In a lot of our classes, we are having these difficult conversations and uncomfortable conversations. And sometimes the conversation goes on for 30 minutes, and sometimes there's nothing to say. We don't know where it's going to go, or, how to keep it going, but at least we're bringing it up, and it's opening the doors and opening, the opportunity for change within not only the students, the teachers, but the students that we are teaching in our classrooms.
Because I suspect, I mean, and Robert, you touched on this, there's a lot of families who live in a neighborhood where people look like themselves, and they don't get out of their comfort zone. They don't get out of their neighborhood. So is it through books, as Faraday's suggesting? Is that how you start that conversation, that we don't all look the same or we don't all speak the same language? Is that a good starting point?
Oh, absolutely. We have a dearth of opportunities to get into cultures that do not belong to us or that we're not familiar with, thanks to Netflix and YouTube and National Geographic and the Discovery Channel, right? We can get into that stuff if we do, and we can do it on purpose as well. So if you want your family, you want your kids to be learning from people who don't look like them, and you can't get out of your house right now, you don't often get out of your neighborhood, and you have access to those programs, jump in there. When the libraries are open, you have access to any number of authors or with names that you didn't grow up reading, so that's fun for both you and your kid. Yeah, that's a great place to start, especially because we can't be with each other the same way right now.
I would agree with that. I think a resource I give to parents a lot is something called Common Sense Media. It's an organization that likes to pull together representation from diverse backgrounds in terms of all sorts of media, whether it's television, books, movies. They have recommendations across all of those areas. I think another thing that can be an experience while we are staying at home, and we should stay at home right now, but we have some great local history, whether it's visiting the Blair Caldwell Library or the Black America West Museum. I think those are great places to learn about Colorado's rich history that can really introduce kids at an early level or an early age to the diversity of experience that calls Colorado home.
That's a great suggestion. I want to start wrapping up, but I want to hear what each of you has to say to those who say it's not their place to step up in this conversation. What would you say to those folks? Lindsay, I'll start with you.
I think what I would say is asking why they think that. And again, just the same as you would have that conversation with a child, is being able to ask, well, tell me more about why you feel that way, and trying to get to where that's coming from. And for instance, that's one of the reasons why we created the resource that we did and opened it up beyond Girl Scouts, is we did feel like a lot of people were coming to us saying, we want to be a part of this, but we don't really feel like it's our place, or we feel awkward doing it. So we wanted to be able to give some resources to start that, and to be able to just take the pressure off feeling like, well, I'm not an expert in this. I know I've felt that way too. Well, maybe I'm not the expert in this. Should I even be talking about it? But I do feel like having the support of the community to be able to say, what can we do and how can we help, and asking questions is really important.
Faraday, how about you? What would you say to those who say it's not their place to step up in this conversation about race and diversity?
I would say that we need you. We need you to have these conversations to make a change. It's going to take every single one of us to ask questions, to be uncomfortable, to say the wrong things sometimes, but that's how we're going to learn and grow and really make a change for the better.
And Dr. Freeman?
I agree. I think one, that we do need you. We need you to be part of this conversation. We've actually had this conversation within the healthcare setting of, well, is it really healthcare's job to get involved in issues related to race and diversity? We know there's something called health disparities, and we know that we have unequal outcomes for people based on, or that show up in different races and ethnicities. And I think for us as health professionals, we recognize that doesn't make sense. That's not right. That's not achieving health outcomes. That's what we're working towards. And when we see that issues of racism are playing into these health outcomes, that's why we have to take action. Because if we're going to get to a healthier America, to a healthier community, we've got to work on that so that we make sure that our entire community is healthy.
Great. And Robert Franklin, you get the last word.
I love it. I love that. The movement will be intersectional. None of the great movements, the civil rights movement, the LGBTQ plus movement, the ability movement, none of them were done in a monolith with just the people who were being oppressed or needed access or resources. There were white folks who marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? There were people who didn't use wheelchairs that made sure that we had curb cuts here in Denver in our sidewalks. And so it's everyone's place. If you believe that this world should be fair and equitable, then you're the one we need in this work. I'll echo what everyone has said so far. It's intersectional. We need everybody.
Okay, well, thank you all so much. Great insight. Thank you for the great conversation. I appreciate all of you, and thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having us.
You
Thank
bet.
you for having
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Being an ally is a verb, not a noun. It's the commitment to a lifelong journey of learning about and appreciating our differences. Our discussion today is just the start of the conversation. If you are ready to continue on this journey, then Girl Scouts of Colorado's diverse, inclusive, Together program is the perfect next step. We're all familiar with the badges and patches that Girl Scouts earn and display on their sashes or vests. Usually you have to be a Girl Scout to take part in this, but not in this case. Girl Scouts of Colorado has a free patch program with age-appropriate activities around issues of race and racism, and they're inviting everyone, not just Girl Scouts, to take part in this program. Denver 7 is proud to be a partner in helping get the word out so that as many of you as possible can take part in this free program. We encourage families to go through the program together. It will help expose you to the rich diversity of various cultures in your community and in the world. And it will deepen your understanding and respect for people who may be different from you. This new program can be completed by any youth in grades K through 12 and is a great activity to complete as a family. The free program can be accessed online at girlscoutsofcolorado.org and is available in both Spanish and English. I'm Ann Trujillo. Thank you for joining us for today's Conversation Starter, and we hope you take the next step in this journey with us.